What if the oldest stories etched into the clay of our world were not myths, not metaphors, but fractured reports of something far older than even the earliest civilizations dared to claim? What if the neat timelines we learned in school, of simple villages slowly evolving into cities, are only the shallowest surface of a story that stretches back into a darkness we were never meant to illuminate? For thousands of years, tablets buried beneath the Mesopotamian plains have whispered of kings who ruled not for decades, not for centuries, but for tens of thousands of years at a time. And the deeper you look, the more it feels as if history is not a straight line at all, but a tapestry layered over something older, something deliberate, something hidden. Imagine learning that the beginning of civilization might not be a mere 6,000 years ago, but hundreds of thousands of years deeper, long before the Ice Age receded, long before Homo sapiens supposedly organized anything resembling a state. Imagine discovering that the Sumerians, our oldest recorded civilization, claimed they inherited their world from beings who ruled for 241,000 years. And imagine realizing that, for generations, scholars and institutions quietly pushed these claims aside, not because the numbers were meaningless, but because they raised questions no one wanted to answer. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into forgotten chapters of our past, feel free to like and subscribe. Only if it feels natural, never out of obligation. And as you settle in, let me softly ask, where are you listening from? And what time has this story found you? The visuals in this documentary can add context, but they're entirely optional. The story can guide you just as well with your eyes closed. So get comfortable, dim the lights just a little, and settle in for a journey into a timeline that hums beneath the one we think we know. If you want to truly understand the mystery of the Sumerian kings, who supposedly ruled for hundreds of millennia, you have to begin in a place that feels impossibly quiet today. It's a desolate expanse of earth near a site called Shurupak, where the ground ripples with pale dust and the horizon hangs low like a faint, trembling line. If you were to walk there at sunrise, you'd feel the air shift with a soft, metallic stillness, as if the desert itself remembers a time before it was a desert at all. This is where archaeologists uncovered some of the earliest cuneiform tablets, fragile clay squares no larger than your palm, filled with wedge-shaped strokes that look almost like scratches from a dreaming creature. But those strokes became the backbone of human history. They revealed kings, floods, lineages, and reigns so long they seem impossible. One of these tablets, cracked in half like an ancient fossil, recorded the reign of a king named Alulim, the first ruler after kingship descended from heaven. The tablet claims he ruled for 28,800 years. Not 28, not 280, 28,800. And Alulim isn't an outlier. The kings who followed him also ruled for spans that defy every biological and historical model we accept today. 36,000 years, 43,200 years, 64,800 years. Numbers so vast they almost slip out of meaning, until you notice something strange. Different versions of the King List, from Kish, from Uruk, from Nippur, don't agree on every king, but they repeat the same long reigns with eerie consistency. Scholars tried to dismiss these numbers as symbolic, as metaphors for legitimacy or divine favor. But if that were true, why are the durations so specific? Why are they divisible into repeated cycles of 3,600 years? Why do the Sumerians insist the kingship descended from heaven only once, then continued through thousands of generations. As you stand near the excavated layers, where the soil shifts from smooth sand to compacted sediment, rich with the memory of ancient rivers, there's a certain feeling that creeps into your bones. It's not fear, it's not awe. It's the subtle sense that something about this place is out of place, like walking into a room after someone has left and feeling the warmth of a presence that shouldn't be there. The air over Shurupak holds that same warmth, as though the land itself remembers a cadence of time lost to us. When researchers examined the strata here, they found a curious band of silty clay, nearly 2 meters thick, that shouldn't exist in a desert. It looked like flood residue, compacted by centuries of pressure. Some immediately connected it to the Sumerian flood myth, the Great Deluge, the same story echoed in the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and later in the Book of Genesis. But the puzzle deepens. The flood layer corresponds not to a single event, but to a repeating pattern of collapses, each separated by vast spans of time. It's as if the region remembers multiple endings, multiple resets, and the King List seems to align with that pattern. The Sumerian scribes divided their kings into before the flood and after the flood. The pre-flood kings ruled for hundreds of millennia. The post-flood kings ruled for human-looking spans, decades, maybe a century at most. It's as if something, some force, some cataclysm, or maybe some external presence, reset the clock on sovereignty itself. Standing among the ruins of Shurupak, with the sun creeping higher, you can almost imagine the landscape shifting under your feet, peeling back layers of dust to reveal a kingdom so old its stones have melted into the earth. This is our doorway into the mystery. A cracked tablet, recovered from a silent plain, describing a sequence of rulers whose reigns stretch beyond human comprehension. If the Sumerians invented numbers for trade, agriculture, and daily life, why would they abandon logic only when recording their earliest history? Why choose to document time in the tens of thousands of years if it served no functional purpose? Why write such precise durations rather than poetic approximations? These are the questions archaeologists still struggle to answer. As we gather more evidence, anomalies begin to cluster around this narrative, like stars forming a new constellation. In Nippur, another King List tablet was found with different kings, but almost identical reign lengths, another 241,000 years total before the flood washed the world clean. Then, in Uruk, a series of tablets described the founding of Eridu, the first city, as a gift from beings who walked like men but lived like something else. These beings were said to have taught the earliest humans how to build, farm, measure the heavens, and write. Some texts call them the Anunna. Others use a term that came later, Anunnaki. According to mainstream scholarship, the Anunnaki were simply deities of Sumerian mythology. But the earliest tablets describe them not as clouds or forces of nature, but as figures who stood tall, who walked among men, who were flesh though not born of the earth. You can sense the discomfort this creates in academic circles. To preserve the timeline, to keep the model intact, scholars propose that early Sumerians exaggerated these reigns for symbolic reasons. They say long numbers represent prestige, cosmic cycles, or literary tradition. But the more you examine the tablets, the more the explanations feel thin. The reigns of later kings, those after the flood, are recorded with full precision, matching archaeological records. Why would a culture capable of such accurate bookkeeping suddenly abandon accuracy when describing their own origins? Another anomaly comes from the city of Eridu itself. Beneath the visible ruins of its ziggurat, archaeologists found layer after layer of earlier temples, 17 in total, each built upon the remains of the one before it. But here is the strange part. The earliest layers, the ones closest to the bedrock, display architectural precision and material quality superior to the layers above. The oldest ruins are the most advanced. Over time, the temples become simpler, cruder, as if the original knowledge faded with each generation. This is the inverse of what we expect from a slowly developing society. It suggests decline, not evolution. If you stand at the edge of the dried lake bed near ancient Eridu and let your eyes wander towards the shimmering horizon, you might imagine what this place looked like when the Sumerians called it the abode of the gods. They believed kingship began here, not with nomads gathering into tribes, but with a direct transfer of authority from beings who already understood the shape of the world. And they believed that after each cataclysm, after each flood, the survivors rebuilt according to memories older than memory itself. We also find clues in a site far from Mesopotamia, deep in southeast Turkey, Göbekli Tepe. Though not Sumerian, it challenges the same assumptions. The stone circles here date back to around 10,000 BCE, thousands of years before agriculture, writing, or cities should have existed. But the carvings on the pillars show animals from climates long vanished, constellations from a sky that no longer matches our own, and strange humanoid figures with elongated arms and stone belts. Most importantly, the site seems intentionally buried, as if someone tried to preserve it for future ages, or hide it from them. It is a ghost of a world that shouldn't exist, yet does. And its sudden appearance in the archaeological record hints at a memory echoing the Sumerian story, a lost civilization emerging from the shadow of a cataclysm. Further south, the ruins of Baalbek in Lebanon present an even more jarring puzzle. At its base lies the Trilithon, 3 enormous stone blocks weighing up to 800 tons each, positioned with such precision that modern cranes would struggle to lift them. These foundation stones predate the Roman temple built on top of them, leading some to propose a much older origin. The precision, the scale, and the placement suggest a technology or engineering capability unaccounted for in the mainstream timeline. Why would the earliest layers of human construction be the most impossible? When you weave these threads together, the impossible reign lengths, the advanced early architecture, the recurring flood traditions, the impossible stones, something begins to take shape. Not a definitive answer, but a presence, a pattern, a memory of an age before our age. Something powerful, organized, and deeply intertwined with the earliest civilizations. Whether it was a lost human culture, a forgotten branch of our species, or beings the Sumerians mythologized as gods, we cannot say with certainty. But the story that emerges from these clues refuses to fit neatly into the orthodox model. The mainstream perspective holds that the King List is mythological, that the immense reign lengths symbolize cosmic order or astrological cycles, that the earliest temples of Eridu are simply over-interpreted remnants of early settlement patterns, that Baalbek's enormous stones can be explained by imaginative theories of manpower and simple but effective ancient engineering, and that Göbekli Tepe, while remarkable, was simply built by hunter-gatherers who happened to innovate earlier than their neighbors. These explanations are presented calmly, professionally, with footnotes and citations. And yet, there is an unspoken tension. They preserve the accepted timeline at all costs. But when you stand in the dust of Shurupak, when you hold a cracked tablet that insists a king ruled for 36,000 years, when you look at the oldest stone foundations of Eridu or Baalbek and realize they surpass the skill of later builders, the mainstream view begins to feel incomplete. Not wrong, just insufficient. Like a puzzle solved too quickly, with pieces left over that don't fit but can't be thrown away. As wind brushes across the eastern plains of Mesopotamia, stirring the fine dust into swirling patterns that dance like echoes of forgotten dynasties, you can almost feel the weight of the vanished timeline pressing against our own. Maybe the Sumerians weren't telling myths. Maybe they were remembering something. Dimly, imperfectly, like a dream you try to describe after waking. Maybe the extraordinary rains were not exaggerations, but records inherited from a culture that lived through cycles of cataclysm and renewal. And maybe, buried beneath the neat chronology we've built for ourselves, lies a story of kings who ruled not as humans, but as shepherds of humanity itself. As we move deeper into this investigation, we'll explore what those long reigns might truly represent. Lost epochs of civilization, forgotten technologies, and a cosmology built around beings who guided early humanity before disappearing into the cataclysm that reshaped the world. For now, all we know is that the journey into the 241,000 years of forgotten rule has only just begun. If you truly want to understand the mystery of the 241,000-year reigns, you have to slow down and let your mind adjust to a different sense of time, one that stretches far beyond the comfort of human history. Our species records memory in centuries, occasionally millennia. But the Sumerians were pointing to epochs so long that even imagining them feels like trying to stare into deep water at night. The numbers strain the imagination not because they are absurd, but because they imply a world shaped by forces and beings whose existence would rewind everything we think we know about our origins. When you first look at the Sumerian King List, the numbers feel impossible. But as you read deeper, a strange consistency begins to emerge, almost like a rhythm. 28,800 years, 36,000, 43,200, 64,800. These reign lengths aren't random. They appear to follow a repeating cycle of 3,600 years. In Sumerian mathematics, 3,600 was more than just a number. It was a sacred unit, called a sar, a complete cycle of time, a turning of something cosmic. Why would the earliest scribes encode the reigns of their kings using a multiplicative structure rooted in a cosmic cycle? Why would a simple list of rulers reflect astronomical mathematics? And here, quietly woven into the clay, you begin to see the outline of a pattern. The Sumerians were obsessed with cycles of the sky. They tracked the movements of the stars with uncanny precision. They divided the heavens into paths and measured the motions of planets before the invention of telescopes. To them, time wasn't linear. It was circular, vast wheels turning within wheels. If the reigns of the earliest kings were measured not in human lifespans, but in cycles of a cosmic order, then the King List may not be describing lifetimes at all. It may be documenting ages, epochs under the stewardship of beings who weren't bound by human mortality. To explore this possibility, you need to walk deeper into Nippur, the ancient spiritual center of Sumer. Nippur wasn't a political capital. It wasn't the wealthiest city or the most powerful. But to the Sumerians, it was the heart of their world, the place where kingship itself was legitimized. If a king didn't receive his authority from the temple of Enlil in Nippur, he wasn't truly a king. And this raises a strange question. Why was a single city the gatekeeper of legitimate rulership? What power did Nippur hold that transcended political authority? Archaeologists excavated the temple of Enlil in the early 20th century, revealing layer after layer of construction dating back thousands of years. But the deeper they dug, the more peculiar things became. The foundation levels didn't look primitive. They looked old, yes, but not crude. The cuts in the stone, the alignment of the walls, the artifacts found buried in the lowest layers all suggested a level of organization you don't typically associate with a newly developing culture. The oldest structures seemed deliberate, almost too deliberate, as though built by a culture fully formed from the beginning. The King List supports this implication. It describes kingship as something that descended from heaven at Eridu, moved to Kish, then passed through Uruk, Ur, Adab, and so on, each time transferring authority like a baton in a long relay of world ages. It never describes the rise of kingship as something humans created. It portrays it as something received, granted, brought from elsewhere. Standing in the ruins of Nippur, with its cracked bricks and wind-swept courtyards, you start to sense that kingship in Sumer wasn't just political. It was cosmological. A ritual reenactment of a time when rulers were not simply men with authority, but intermediaries between humankind and something older, something that the Sumerians remembered as the Anunna. To follow this trail, you need to look at texts that sit just outside the spotlight of mainstream scholarship. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest creation myths, describes a time before the flood when cities were governed by beings who lived in direct communion with the divine assembly. These beings are described as wise, powerful, and long-lived. They established laws, agriculture, astronomy, and architecture. They shaped the early world not as distant gods, but as active participants, teachers, overseers, figures of authority walking among humans. Yet another text, the Cylinder of Entemena, describes these same beings as those who decreed fate. They knew the cycles of the heavens, the rhythms of nature, and the changing of ages. They weren't omnipotent, but they were above human limitation. Their power came from knowledge that allowed them to predict the cataclysms, the floods, the changes in climate and sky. And then, suddenly, the texts shift. After the Great Flood, an event described with remarkable consistency across Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and later into Hebrew and Greek traditions, the reigns of kings shrink dramatically. Instead of tens of thousands of years, kings now rule for decades, occasionally a century, rarely more. It's as if something was lost in the transition from pre-flood to post-flood civilization. Something monumental. This transition is visible in the ground itself. At Ur, archaeologists found a massive flood deposit, thick, compressed, indicative of a sudden event. The same layer appears in Shuruppak, Kish, and even further along the Euphrates. But what's more intriguing is what appears beneath that flood layer. Signs of a sophisticated society with structured governance, writing, standardized measurements, trade networks, and agriculture far more advanced than the surrounding regions. It's as if civilization didn't emerge after the flood. It rebooted after the flood. And here is where the anomalies become too numerous to ignore. In 1922, archaeologist Leonard Woolley surveyed the deep layers beneath Ur. When he reached the flood deposit, he expected a transition into primitive pre-civilized strata. Instead, he found remains of organized settlements, kilns, pottery workshops, and evidence of administrative activity. The deeper he went, the more advanced the structures appeared, until he reached a point where the architecture became unexpectedly refined. Woolley was baffled. How could the earliest layers, the ones closest to the bedrock, display a level of craftsmanship more advanced than the layers above them? He suggested the flood wiped out an early chapter of civilization, but he didn't push the idea further. The implications were too immense for the archaeological model of the time, and even today, they challenge the conventional narrative of human development. As we follow the evidence, a pattern emerges. Göbekli Tepe shows advanced engineering appearing suddenly without a precursor. Jericho shows fortifications older than agriculture. The Vinca culture of southeastern Europe produced symbolic writing before Sumer, yet leaves behind no context explaining who taught them. The megaliths of Malta appear abruptly with no developmental stages. The precise stonework of Peru predates the civilizations that inherited it. The trilithon stones of Baalbek lie beneath later Roman structures, carved with impossible precision. Everywhere you look, the oldest layers are the most sophisticated. And now when you return to the Sumerian King List with this new perspective, the reign lengths begin to feel less like absurdities and more like the echoes of a world that once operated on a different scale entirely. Imagine a civilization where leadership wasn't passed from father to son, but maintained by a small group of long-lived beings, or a council with knowledge that allowed them to remain active for millennia. Imagine that their longevity wasn't biological in the way we understand it, but technological, rooted in medicine, genetics, or environmental conditions now lost to history. Or imagine something else altogether, that these beings weren't human, that they came from elsewhere, another region of Earth now submerged or erased, or perhaps a place far beyond our world. The Sumerians never explicitly said the Anunna were extraterrestrial, but they described them coming from the sky, descending to Earth, and returning to the heavens when their work was done. These descriptions need not be literal, but they invite questions that ordinary archaeology refuses to entertain. And yet, even among mainstream scholars, there are subtle acknowledgments that something about the ancient Near East doesn't fit. Philologists quietly debate why early Sumerian writing appears mature from the outset. Anthropologists wrestle with the fact that agriculture in Mesopotamia emerged suddenly, without a clear developmental pathway. Astronomers question why Sumerian celestial knowledge was so advanced for its time. These disciplines rarely communicate with one another, and when they do, the picture becomes muddled. But if you step back and look at the entire landscape of evidence, the outline of a hidden chapter begins to take shape. This is where the tension between mainstream and unaccepted views sharpens. The orthodox model insists that the reign lengths are symbolic, that the gods are metaphorical, that flood layers correspond to local disasters, and that early civilizations advanced through trial and error. But the unaccepted view, quietly, stubbornly persistent, suggests that the earliest civilizations were inheritors, not inventors, that they received fragments of knowledge from cultures erased by cataclysm, that the world before the flood was structured differently, governed differently, perhaps even inhabited differently. And then there is the question of the 241,000-year total. Why this number? Why not round it to a tidy figure like 200,000 or 300,000? Why such precision? If you add the reign lengths of the pre-flood kings, they sum to a specific number, 241,200 years. But some tablets record 241,000, suggesting a scribal variation. Regardless of which version you use, the pattern is clear. The Sumerians were preserving something. Not myth, not metaphor. Memory of an era that ended with a flood. Memory of rulers whose authority wasn't political, but cosmic. Memory of a world lost beneath layers of mud, silt, and the silence of time. As you stand in the dust of ancient Nippur, you can almost imagine these kings, not as humans, but as luminous figures walking through an early world lit by a younger sun. Imagine Alulim, the first king, watching the rise and fall of entire generations as though they were seasons. Imagine Dumuzid the shepherd, ruling over a land where the sky resembled a clock made of stars, whose positions have shifted since that age. Imagine Enmengalana, whose reign spanned so many millennia that mountains eroded beneath his watch. It sounds impossible. It sounds fantastical. And yet the tablets insist it was true. As we move into the next part of this journey, we'll begin to stitch these fragments into a possible narrative, one that explores who these beings might have been, what kind of civilization they oversaw, and what could have caused their world to end. Because to understand the truth hidden in the 241,000 years of forgotten rule, we must piece together the broken mirror of prehistory and ask one haunting question. What kind of world existed before ours? To continue unraveling the mystery of the 241,000-year reigns, you have to step even further out of the comfortable frame of human history. The deeper we travel into this story, the more the world before the flood begins to feel like a separate reality, one whose footprints still linger in the dust of our cities, in the myths of ancient peoples, and in the impossible architecture scattered across continents. If the Sumerians preserved the memory of an age ruled by beings who lived for tens of thousands of years, then we must ask, what kind of civilization would such beings have built? And what traces of it, if any, survived the cataclysm that ended their rule? To explore this, imagine standing in Eridu, not as it is now, a weathered ruin beneath the desert sky, but as it might have been in the time before the flood. Imagine a shimmering city built around a freshwater marsh, its canals glistening with the reflection of a sky that looked different from ours, clearer, deeper, untouched by industrial haze or the scars of millennia. The earliest layers of Eridu suggest a complex settlement, structured irrigation systems, organized temple precincts, and pottery that demonstrates both artistic skill and standardized production methods. Archaeologists have tried to place Eridu within the slow development of early human society, but something about its earliest phase resists that narrative. The sophistication appears too quickly, too fully formed, as if someone arrived with a blueprint rather than learning by trial and error. If the earliest kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, then perhaps they bore witness to environmental patterns and cosmic cycles that no modern human has ever experienced. They would have watched the shifting of the earth's precession like a slow breath of the sky. They would have seen coastlines advance and retreat, climates transform, rivers carve new paths. Imagine a single ruler overseeing what we would consider entire geological epochs. Their perspective on civilization, stability, and continuity would be unimaginable to us. And perhaps this is why the Sumerians described those kings as shepherds, not conquerors. Their role may have been custodial, not political, guides rather than generals. To understand the nature of such guidance, researchers have studied Sumerian myths not as literal accounts, but as encoded memory. The myth of Enki teaching humans the arts of civilization, the me, could be a poetic preservation of an earlier transmission of knowledge. The me were not inventions, they were gifts. Law, mathematics, agriculture, writing, architecture, the foundations of civilization, were said to be bestowed, not discovered. When you read these texts with the assumption that they are metaphors, they sound like religious stories. But when you read them as memory fragments, they begin to resemble descriptions of cultural inheritance from a vanished world. One of the most intriguing clues comes from an ancient text called the Instructions of Shurupak, attributed to a pre-flood king who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years. It contains practical advice on ethics, on agriculture, on relationships, written with a tone of calm, timeless wisdom. But hidden within the text is something else. References to specific environmental cycles, changes in the rivers, shifts in the seasons. These references suggest a deep awareness of long-term natural rhythms, the kind of knowledge that would only be possible for someone who lived through multiple epochs. Mainstream scholars insist the text was composed much later by scribes who adapted older traditions. And yet, the perspective woven into the instructions feels older than any single human life. Another piece of evidence comes from agricultural records. The earliest Sumerian accounts describe varieties of grain that appear unusually robust, adapted to climates different from the ones that existed in Mesopotamia during the post-flood era. Botanists have struggled to explain how these grains appeared so suddenly. Their genetic lineage does not easily trace back to wild ancestors in the region. Some researchers speculate that early humans selectively bred them over centuries, but this explanation feels thin when you consider the speed with which agriculture emerged after the flood. It is as if someone, somewhere, preserved the knowledge of cultivation through the cataclysm. If you stand on the edge of the Euphrates today, where the river shifts through a landscape of reeds, dust, and quiet farmland, it's hard to imagine the world that existed before the flood. But the soil itself remembers. Deep core samples taken from ancient Mesopotamian floodplains reveal layers of pollen, seeds, and microscopic organisms that do not match the post-flood environment. The pre-flood layer appears richer, more diverse, more stable. It suggests a world that was well-maintained, almost curated. Could the pre-flood kings have been the curators? This idea is difficult for modern minds to accept because it implies a level of organization and stewardship that predates known civilizations by vast stretches of time. But when you examine early myths from cultures around the world, a consistent theme emerges. Before the Great Flood, the world was overseen by beings who maintained cosmic order. The Greeks called them the Golden Race. The Egyptians called them the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who ruled for thousands of years before the dynasties. The Hindus described the yugas, epochs ruled by long-lived beings. The Maya recorded earlier ages of human-like creatures guided by gods who walked among them. These parallels are dismissed by mainstream academia as the natural tendency of human societies to create myths. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps these myths are simply the imaginative echoes of early human attempts to explain their world. But the consistency across cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, raises a question. Why do they all remember the same story? Why do they all describe an age before our age, overseen by beings of extraordinary longevity? Why do they all record a cataclysm that ended that epoch, followed by the rise of regular humans in a diminished world? One explanation is that these stories were carried by survivors, scattered across the globe after the cataclysmic event that ended the rule of the 241,000-year kings. These survivors may have preserved fragments of knowledge, rituals, and memory that later cultures transformed into myth. If so, then the Sumerian King List is not an anomaly. It is the most complete remnant of a story that once spanned continents. To test this possibility, researchers have examined early calendars. The oldest calendars, Sumerian, Egyptian, Mayan, are all rooted in astronomical cycles far more precise than what early humans should have been able to measure. The Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees. They understood the precession of the equinoxes. They tracked the movements of Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, and Mercury. How did the earliest civilization inherit such advanced astronomical knowledge? Mainstream scholars suggest careful observation and incremental innovation. But those methods would require centuries, even millennia, of uninterrupted record-keeping. Such continuity is unlikely in a newly settled farming society. Something or someone must have introduced the blueprint. If the pre-flood kings were observers of the heavens, custodians of cosmic order, then perhaps their reign lengths reflect astronomical cycles rather than biological lifespan. Their authority may have been tied to celestial events, alignments, precessional shifts, or planetary movements we no longer track. This brings us to a peculiar detail in the King List. The reign lengths before the flood are measured in sars, nurs, and sos, units of 3,600, 600, and 60. These are not arbitrary. They reflect a sexagesimal counting system, yes, but they also align with orbital periods that some have speculated may reference cycles not immediately visible today. A few fringe researchers have suggested that the Sumerians encoded the presence of an additional celestial body in their mathematics. Mainstream scholars reject this theory completely. But it is worth asking, why would the earliest civilization use such large, cosmic-scaled units of time to record the reigns of earthly kings? What were they measuring? If you imagine the pre-flood world not as a primitive landscape, but as a stable, long-lived culture guided by beings attuned to cosmic cycles, then the King List becomes something other than a historical oddity. It becomes a window, cracked and dust-covered, into a world where the line between astronomy and governance was blurred. In that world, kingship was not political. It was cosmic. Each king's reign marked an era, a turning of the celestial wheel. And when the wheel completed a full cycle, rulership moved to a new figure, not because the previous king died, but because a new epoch had begun. This interpretation aligns with another anomaly, the sudden disappearance of advanced knowledge after the flood. If the pre-flood kings were long-lived overseers, then their departure, whether through death, exile, or cosmic necessity, would have resulted in a massive loss of knowledge. The survivors would have remembered fragments, but not the whole. They would have rebuilt what they could, but the continuity would have been broken. This explains why early post-flood civilizations display sudden sophistication followed by gradual decline. They were inheritors of a broken legacy. To find evidence of this, you must examine the earliest temples of Eridu, Uruk, and Ur. In the lowest levels, the buildings seem designed with an understanding of sacred geometry. Their alignments match significant stellar positions, not always the ones visible today, but ones that would have been prominent thousands of years before the flood. As time passes, the alignments grow less precise, suggesting the loss of knowledge rather than its accumulation. Imagine walking through the first temple of Eridu. The air would have felt cool, the floor made of carefully laid stone, the walls adorned with symbols representing cycles of the sky. The temple's alignment may have followed a particular constellation that marked the passage into a new cosmic age. The king who ruled during that epoch would have been a custodian of the transition, his reign length marking the duration of that cycle. But then the flood came. The flood was not merely a local disaster. It was a global cataclysm, one remembered in myths from every corner of the world. Whether caused by melting ice, shifting tectonic plates, or a sudden astronomical event, the flood wiped out the pre-flood civilization and scattered its survivors. The kingship that had descended from heaven was severed. The cosmic order collapsed. And the world that emerged afterward was fundamentally different. Harsher, more fragmented, governed by ordinary human lifespans and fragile political structures. This explains the dramatic reduction in reign lengths after the flood. It wasn't just that human kings were mortal. It was that the cosmic order that governed the pre-flood world no longer existed. The custodians were gone. The cycles were broken. The survivors were left to rebuild with whatever knowledge they could salvage. Now imagine being one of those survivors, standing on the muddy plain as the waters receded, surrounded by the ruins of a world that had lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine carrying the memory of long-lived rulers who walked with a calm that only beings who witness millennia can possess. Imagine trying to preserve those memories through oral tradition, through songs, through ritual, until finally someone carved them into clay. This is the story preserved in the Sumerian King List. This is the story of the 241,000 years they tried to hide. And in the next part of this journey, we'll begin to explore the identity of these long-lived beings, whether they were human, more than human, or something else entirely. We will follow the trail of their influence across continents, through myths, and into the deepest layers of archaeological anomalies. Because the true mystery is not just how long they ruled, it's who they were. To understand who ruled during those impossible spans of 241,000 years, you have to let go of the idea that our species has always been the central character in the story of civilization. The Sumerians themselves never claimed that the earliest rulers were ordinary humans. In fact, the more you read their oldest tablets, the more you notice a quiet but unmistakable line drawn between the world of humans and the world of the beings who came before. Those beings, according to the texts, were physical enough to walk the streets of Eridu, to sit on thrones, to engage in courtly life and political disputes. And yet they were something more, something older, longer lived, capable of guiding entire eras of civilization from birth to destruction. If you stand amidst the ruins of the earliest Sumerian cities today, Eridu, Uruk, Shuruppak, Kish, you might feel a strange disconnect. The ruins that archaeologists unearth are from the later periods, the eras we can confidently date, the Ubaid period, the Uruk period, the early dynastic period. But beneath those layers, the older strata tell a different story, one of abrupt emergence rather than gradual development. The first writing system appears fully formed. The first cities appear with sophisticated architecture. The first laws appear with structured logic. It is as though someone pressed start on civilization, not develop. This leads to the question that sits at the center of the Sumerian King List. Who were the beings who ruled before the flood? The key lies in the earliest Sumerian term for them, the Anunna. Not gods in the later religious sense, not celestial abstractions, but a group, always described as a council, a collective, an assembly. They were said to have walked among humans, taught them, punished them, chosen rulers among them, and eventually abandoned them. Their presence is carved into tablets, not as mythic symbolism, but as historical recollection. In the earliest layers of Sumerian writing, the Anunna were described as those who descended, those who decree destinies, those of the shining countenance, and those who came from the high places. Later scribes, attempting to preserve memory through a religious lens, transformed them into deities. But the earliest accounts sound more like descriptions of a ruling elite, a group with authority, knowledge, and longevity that surpassed human understanding. The Sumerians divided these beings into several categories. The Anunna were the most ancient, the pre-flood overseers. The Igigi were another group, often depicted as younger, more restless, perhaps subordinates or assistants. And then there were the 7 sages, the Apkallu, who were said to have emerged from the waters before the flood, teaching humanity skills like farming, weaving, and measuring the heavens. If you consider these categories not as literal species, but as layers of memory, a pattern emerges. Ancient cultures often preserved the idea of multiple orders of beings, some ancient, some intermediate, some acting as messengers or teachers. The Greeks remembered the Titans, the Olympians, and the demigods. The Egyptians remembered the Shemsu-Hor, followed by the pharaohs. The Hindus remembered the Devas, the Asuras, and the Rishis. In each case, there is a sense of an earlier, more powerful order, giving way to a later, diminished one. The Sumerian King List continues this pattern. The pre-flood kings are associated with the Anunna. The post-flood kings are associated with ordinary humans. The transition between the two, the flood, is the dividing line between the cosmic and the mortal. To explore the nature of these beings further, let's step into one of the earliest temples of Eridu, the Abzu, the House of the Deep Waters. It was dedicated to Enki, one of the principal figures of the Anunna. Enki is often depicted as a wise, scientific, almost paternal figure. He teaches humans the arts of civilization, warns them of impending danger, and attempts to mitigate the harsh decrees of other members of the assembly. He is not portrayed as omnipotent. He is portrayed as knowledgeable, strategic, and deeply concerned with the continuity of life. Some scholars interpret Enki as a symbol of water and wisdom. But what if he was something else? What if he represented a real figure or a lineage of figures who played a critical role in preserving knowledge during cycles of cataclysm? Imagine a being, or a group of beings, possessing an understanding of environmental cycles, climatic changes, and astronomical shifts. Imagine them watching the slow build-up toward the flood, the gradual warming of the climate, the rising waters, the instability in the skies. Imagine them trying to guide humanity through it. The Sumerians described the Anunna as those who observe 10,000 years as easily as we observe a single day. They described them standing tall, shining with some kind of radiance or presence that was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. These descriptions could be symbolic, but they could also be the filtered memory of a different kind of human, or something beyond human. If you imagine these beings as physical entities, perhaps they were part of an ancient branch of humanity that no longer exists. A lineage with longevity far beyond our own, possibly due to environmental factors, genetics, or technological intervention. A lineage that could have survived through multiple ice ages, developing knowledge we no longer possess. The flood could have been the event that finally erased them, leaving only scattered survivors who integrated into human society, passing down fragments of knowledge that became myth. Or perhaps they were not human at all. The Sumerians described them as originating in the heavens, but the term heaven in ancient texts often referred to any distant domain. Mountains, islands, regions beyond known travel. If these beings came from a lost continent or a region devastated by cataclysm, their arrival in Sumer would have felt like a descent from another world. But then there is the third possibility, the one that stretches the imagination but has captured the attention of researchers for decades, that these beings were extraterrestrial. This does not require imagining spacecraft or alien worlds. It simply requires acknowledging that life may exist beyond Earth and that contact in the distant past is not impossible. If long-lived beings arrived on Earth thousands of years before the flood, guided early civilizations, and then left or perished, their memory would easily become myth. Mainstream scholars reject all of these interpretations. They argue that the Anunna were purely mythological, created by early humans to explain natural forces and social hierarchies. They point to the evolution of Sumerian religion, showing how the Anunna became more abstract over time. And they note that myth-making is a universal human trait. But even mainstream scholars struggle to explain certain aspects of the earliest Sumerian texts. Why did the Sumerians depict the Anunna as physical beings rather than abstract deities? Why did they give them specific roles, genealogies, conflicts, and personalities? Why did they place them in the context of historical events, floods, wars, kingship transitions, instead of cosmic battles or metaphorical journeys? And why did they preserve them as rulers in the King List, recorded alongside human kings, with reign lengths measured precisely? The academic discomfort with these questions often leads to silence. The conservative view is that ancient peoples were imaginative and symbolic. But the problem with this explanation is not that it is incorrect. It is that it fails to account for the precision of the numbers, the consistency across cultures, and the archaeological evidence that aligns with the myths. Let's look at an example from outside Mesopotamia, the Egyptian Sumerian King List. This ancient papyrus, discovered in fragmented form, records the reigns of pre-dynastic rulers. And like the Sumerian King List, It lists reign lengths of tens of thousands of years. The Egyptian priests described these early rulers as the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, beings who reigned for thousands of years before the pharaohs. Their reigns match the pattern of the Sumerian kings in both scale and structure. Two civilizations, separated by geography and culture, both preserved memories of ancient rulers who lived for incomprehensible spans of time. Mainstream scholars dismiss the Egyptian figures as myth. But why would two unrelated ancient cultures invent the same kind of myth, with the same structure, the same numerical patterns, and the same cosmic context? If you consider the possibility that both cultures inherited memories from a common pre-flood civilization, the parallels make sense. The flood did not erase all knowledge. Survivors carried fragments to different regions. In Mesopotamia, those fragments became the Sumerian King List. In Egypt, they became the Turin Papyrus. In India, they became the Satya Yuga, an age of beings who lived for thousands of years. In Greece, they became the Golden Age of Kronos. In Mesoamerica, they became the records of earlier ages in the Popol Vuh. Across all of these traditions, the pattern is consistent. Long-lived beings ruled before a cataclysm. Humans rose afterward. This leads us back to the heart of the mystery. If the pre-flood kings were beings of extraordinary longevity, what evidence of their presence might survive today? Archaeological evidence is sparse, partly because the flood, or floods, buried much of the pre-flood world beneath thick layers of silt, sand, and sediment. But some evidence does survive. At Eridu, the earliest temple layers show highly advanced construction techniques. The bricks are uniform, the alignments precise, the design symmetrical. Later layers become less refined, as if the builders lost access to the original blueprint. At Uruk, the earliest writing appears suddenly, fully functional, with no signs of gradual development. The script includes words related to astronomy, mathematics, and administration, fields that require advanced knowledge. At Kish, excavation reveals an abrupt shift from pre-flood to post-flood culture, with artifacts beneath the flood layer showing more complexity than those above it. And at Nippur, the Temple of Enlil reveals a foundation level that appears older than the city itself, almost as if it was built by a different civilization entirely. These clues paint a picture of a pre-flood world that was not primitive, but sophisticated, perhaps even more advanced than the world that followed. If you imagine beings who lived for thousands of years, capable of observing long-term cycles and preserving knowledge across epochs, then the emergence of early civilization makes more sense. It didn't emerge. It re-emerged. This framework also explains another puzzling detail. The earliest Sumerian kings, after the flood, often reigned for exactly the same lengths of time as earlier kings, but reduced by orders of magnitude. A king who ruled for 36,000 years before the flood might have a post-flood counterpart who ruled for 36 years. This pattern suggests memory, not myth. It indicates that scribes were trying to preserve the structure of earlier ages in a world where human lifespans could no longer stretch across epochs. And this raises another possibility. What if the pre-flood kings were not individuals, but titles? What if Alulim, the first king, wasn't a single being, but a role passed down through a long lineage of custodians? Each custodian might have served a full cycle, 3,600 years, creating the impression of a single, impossibly long-lived ruler. Later generations, looking back across millennia, might have fused those custodians into a single figure. This interpretation blends well with the idea of the Anunna as overseers of cosmic cycles. Each custodian might have observed a full sar, completing a cycle of the celestial order. When the cycle ended, the title passed to another custodian. Over time, the reign lengths accumulated into the vast numbers recorded in the King List. This model allows us to interpret the pre-flood rulers as a hybrid of human memory and cosmic structure. Long-lived beings or lineages whose authority was tied to time itself. The flood shattered this system. In its aftermath, human kings attempted to imitate the structure, but their reigns were constrained by biological limitations. They could no longer govern for cycles, only for years. This is why the Sumerian King List says, "After the flood had swept over, and kingship descended from heaven a second time." The system was restored, but in diminished form. As we move deeper into this narrative, we will explore the grand theory that ties all of these pieces together, a lost civilization that existed before the flood, guided by beings of extraordinary longevity or lineage whose memory survives in myths across the world. A civilization that fell in a cataclysm so massive it reset the entire human timeline. Because the real question is not whether the Sumerian kings ruled for 241,000 years. It's what kind of world allowed such reigns to exist at all. To move closer to understanding the world that produced 241,000 years of rule, we must begin reconstructing it, not as fantasy, not as myth, but as a lost chapter of human history that left behind fragments too substantial to ignore. These fragments are scattered across continents, buried beneath silt, encoded in myths, etched into stone, and woven into the earliest written words. Each fragment alone is intriguing. Together they begin to form a silhouette, a faint outline of something vast, something structured, something advanced, something that ended so completely that only echoes remain. Imagine the world before the flood, not as the chaotic wilderness that mainstream models assume, but as a landscape shaped by the slow, deliberate actions of long-lived beings who had time, centuries, millennia, to observe, experiment, build, fail, rebuild, and perfect. What kind of architecture would a civilization produce if its leaders lived long enough to see entire rivers change course? What kind of science would emerge if observations spanned thousands of years? What kind of social structure would evolve if knowledge wasn't passed generationally, but remained within a group of custodians who carried memory across epochs? Such a world would appear to its post-flood descendants like a realm of gods. And perhaps that is precisely what happened. If the pre-flood kings were custodians of cosmic cycles, their cities may have been aligned not to the practical needs of farming or trade, but to the rhythms of the sky. When archaeologists study ancient cities, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indus Valley, Mesoamerican, they repeatedly discover alignments with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. The mainstream explanation is ritual symbolism. But what if it was something deeper? A continuation of a pre-flood tradition in which architecture served as a cosmic calendar. A way to synchronize civilization with celestial cycles that governed climate, seasons, and long-term shifts. To explore this possibility, consider the earliest ziggurats of Mesopotamia. Their stepped design is often interpreted as symbolic mountains, a bridge between earth and sky. But their precision, their orientation, and their proportions suggest something functional, not merely symbolic. Some researchers have proposed that the ziggurats served as astronomical platforms, allowing long-term observation of the heavens. Their height and shape would have minimized atmospheric distortion near the horizon. Their staircases would have allowed observers to track positions of stars and planets rising at slightly different angles, and their alignments, precisely north-south or east-west, hint at a purpose more scientific than ceremonial. If the pre-flood kings were observers of the heavens, their cities would have been built as instruments, a network of terrestrial markers aligned with celestial cycles. This aligns with the Sumerian emphasis on me, the divine laws that governed everything from agriculture to astronomy. The me were not inventions. They were inheritances, structures of knowledge passed down from earlier ages. This raises an important question. What kind of knowledge might the pre-flood custodians have preserved? The answer may lie in the oldest forms of mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal, still preserved in our timekeeping, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, and geometry, 360 degrees. The system is extraordinarily efficient for astronomical calculations. It allows easy division by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making it ideal for tracking cycles of planetary motion. Why would the earliest civilization choose such an advanced system? Mainstream scholars argue it evolved from counting with fingers and joints, but alternative researchers suggest it was inherited, part of a larger system of knowledge maintained by long-lived observers who tracked cycles too long for humans to monitor. Consider also the Sumerian obsession with the number 12. 12 major gods, 12 months, 12 constellations. Across cultures, the number 12 appears repeatedly in cosmological systems. This suggests a shared origin, a pre-flood cosmology that spread with survivors. To understand how such knowledge might have survived the flood, we must turn to the Apkallu, the 7 sages. These beings appear in both mythological and historical contexts. They are depicted as half fish, half human, likely symbolic representations of their origin near the water. They are said to have emerged from the ocean to teach humanity the arts of civilization. But they are also said to have lived before the flood, advising the early kings, and that after the flood only one of them, Utanapishtim, survived and was granted immortality. If the Apkallu represent the memory of pre-flood custodians, then their portrayal as hybrid beings may be symbolic of their connection to a world erased by water. Their association with wisdom, science, and architecture suggests that they were the bearers of inherited knowledge, and their disappearance after the flood reflects the break in continuity between the pre-flood and post-flood worlds. But to reconstruct the pre-flood civilization, we must look beyond Sumer. Clues appear in patterns that repeat globally, suggesting a shared memory scattered across continents. In Egypt, the earliest dynastic traditions refer to the Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled the land. The Turin Papyrus lists reigns of thousands of years for the Shemsu Hor, matching the scale of the Sumerian kings. In India, the Satya Yuga describes beings who lived for tens of thousands of years in a world of harmony and advanced knowledge. In Mesoamerica, the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec traditions speak of earlier ages, each ruled by different beings, ending in cataclysms. In Greece, Hesiod wrote of the Golden Age under Kronos, when beings lived for long periods in peace. In China, ancient chronicles describe the reigns of the three sovereigns, divine rulers who lived for thousands of years and taught humanity essential skills. These global parallels are rarely taught in academic settings, yet they form a remarkable pattern. Every ancient civilization remembers a time before human kings, a time of long-lived rulers, a time that ended violently. Why would so many cultures preserve the same structure? If the pre-flood kings existed, their civilization would likely have been global or semi-global, connected not by modern transportation, but by long spans of time that allowed exploration, settlement, and cultural exchange. Long-lived beings could have traveled the world over centuries, establishing outposts, teaching local populations, and maintaining cosmic order across regions. Archaeologists have noticed similarities between early cultures that defy conventional explanations. The construction techniques of megalithic sites in Turkey, Egypt, Peru, and Easter Island share features. Large, polygonal stones fitted with impossible precision, interlocking joints resistant to earthquakes, and alignments with celestial events. The mainstream view is that these similarities arose independently, a case of convergent evolution. But this explanation grows weaker as more evidence accumulates. If the earliest cultures were inheritors of a pre-flood civilization, their architectural similarities become understandable. They were following the same blueprint. The most striking of these sites is Göbekli Tepe, a place that predates agriculture, yet displays monumental architecture. Its builders carved limestone pillars weighing tons, arranged them in circles, adorned them with intricate animal carvings, and aligned them with celestial events. Then, mysteriously, they buried the entire complex under tons of earth. Why? Mainstream archaeologists propose ritualistic burial, but another possibility is that the builders were preserving something, protecting it from the approaching flood or marking the end of an age. If Göbekli Tepe was constructed by the survivors of a pre-flood culture, its sudden appearance and abrupt burial make sense. It was a memory capsule, not a city center. In South America, the site of Sacsayhuaman presents another puzzle. The stone blocks used in its construction are so large that modern equipment struggles to move them. Their surfaces are smoothed with precision, and they fit together without mortar so tightly that even a razor blade cannot fit between them. No known culture in the region possessed the tools or methods to create such structures. The Inca inherited Sacsayhuaman, but could not reproduce it. This suggests that the site predates them, perhaps by thousands of years, belonging to a world whose engineering was lost. Likewise, the megaliths of Baalbek defy explanation. The three trilithon stones each weigh over 800 tons. Beneath them lies the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman, estimated at over 1,000 tons. Some researchers believe the stones were quarried and moved using unknown techniques. But others propose that they are remnants of a pre-flood civilization whose engineering far surpassed what later cultures could achieve. If the pre-flood kings oversaw a technologically advanced world, not in the sense of electricity or machines, but in understanding of stone, astronomy, and natural forces, these megaliths may be relics of their construction methods. After the flood, the knowledge to work with such stones was lost. Later cultures built on top of or around these relics, incorporating them into their own structures without understanding their original purpose. Another clue lies in ancient maps. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513, but based on older sources, shows Antarctica without ice, something mainstream science says has not occurred for tens of thousands of years. The map's accuracy suggests access to ancient charts created by a civilization with global seafaring capabilities. This aligns with the idea that long-lived beings or lineages could have explored the Earth, mapping coastlines that later became submerged or altered by rising sea levels. Likewise, the Antikythera mechanism, a device recovered from a shipwreck in Greece, contains gears capable of predicting astronomical events with remarkable accuracy. Mainstream scholars attribute it to Hellenistic ingenuity, but the precision of its engineering suggests knowledge far older than its apparent date. The Greeks may have inherited the design from earlier cultures. If we combine these clues, advanced pre-flood architecture, astronomical precision, global parallels in myth, long-lived rulers, sudden emergence of civilization, we begin to see a portrait of the world before the flood. It was not a world of scattered tribes. It was a world of knowledge, complex, interconnected, custodial, and aligned with cosmic cycles. But what caused its end? The Sumerian texts describe the flood as a divine decree, a decision by the Anunna to wipe out humanity due to its growing noise and disorder. But if we interpret this through a historical lens, it may reflect a real event, a catastrophic climate shift, glacial melt, or comet impact that forced the custodians to withdraw or perish. The survivors would have interpreted the collapse as divine punishment. In their grief and fear, they preserved the memory in mythic form. Modern geology supports the idea that a massive flood event occurred around the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,900 years ago, during the Younger Dryas period. Meltwater pulses, rising sea levels, and sudden climate shifts could have inundated vast regions. Entire coastlines would have disappeared. Low-lying civilizations would have been erased. If the pre-flood world was coastal, as many advanced civilizations are, its remains may now lie underwater. Marine archaeologists have found evidence of submerged structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Caribbean. Some of these appear to be artificial terraces, walls, and platforms thousands of years older than the post-flood civilizations. If these belonged to the pre-flood world, then their existence supports the idea that the flood was global and catastrophic. After the flood, the survivors rebuilt. But without the custodians, without the continuity of knowledge, their efforts were fragmented. They created cities, rediscovered agriculture, reinvented writing. But the scale and sophistication of their ancestors remained out of reach. The world entered a diminished era, one in which human kings ruled for decades rather than millennia, and knowledge was measured not in cycles of the sky, but in lifetimes. This is the world the Sumerian King List remembers. The pre-flood reigns are not fantasies. They are a record, a distorted, symbolic, but persistent record of a world lost to catastrophe. As we move into the next part of this journey, we will explore the grand theory that binds these fragments into a coherent narrative. A forgotten civilization that thrived before the flood, governed by beings or lineages with extraordinary longevity, whose memory survives in myths around the world. A civilization whose fall reshaped human history forever? Because the truth hidden behind the Sumerian King List is not just about kings who lived for 241,000 years. It's about an entire world we've forgotten. To build a grand theory capable of holding all the fragments together, the long-reigning kings, the global myths of a golden age, the sudden emergence of civilization, the precision of early astronomy, the megalithic architecture spread inexplicably across continents. We have to approach the lost world before the flood not as fantasy, but as a forgotten chapter of human history, erased and overwritten by a cataclysm so complete that only shards of its memory survived in clay, stone, and story. What emerges is a picture far larger than the Sumerian King List alone. It is a vision of a world guided by custodial beings, humans or more than human entities, who stewarded civilization for cycles of time far beyond our comprehension, and whose disappearance forced humanity into a new, diminished age. A grand theory must begin with a central anchor, something stable enough to connect the myths, the tablets, the ruins, the geological clues, and the astronomical mysteries into one coherent framework. And that anchor emerges from the one recurring idea that ancient cultures across the world preserved with remarkable consistency: the existence of a long-lived custodial order before the flood, beings who governed, taught, built, and maintained the world through cosmic cycles. Whether called the Anunna, the Shemsuhor, the Devas, the Apkallu, or the Golden Race, their story is always the same. They lived for vast expanses of time. They possessed knowledge far deeper than their successors, and they disappeared after the flood, leaving humanity to rebuild with only fragments of their legacy. Let us imagine, then, a civilization not bound by the constraints of human lifespan. Imagine a lineage or group of beings who could pass on knowledge across thousands of years without interruption. Imagine what they could observe: the slow drift of the stars due to precession, the rising and falling of sea levels, changes in climate, the cycles of disasters and renewal. Such beings would measure time not in generations, but in cosmic rhythms. They would understand patterns invisible to short-lived cultures. They would build monuments aligned to celestial cycles that take tens of thousands of years to complete. They would encode knowledge in stone, in mathematics, in architecture. They would plan for millennia, not for decades. This is not fantasy. It is, in fact, what the ancient texts describe. The Sumerians wrote that the earliest kings were not truly human. They were those who descended, and their reigns measured not in years, but in sars, 3,600-year cycles. The Egyptians recorded pre-dynastic rulers who lived for 30,000 years. The Hindus described long-lived beings who governed the Satya Yuga, the first of the world ages. The Greeks wrote of the Golden Age, when beings lived for centuries or millennia. The Maya preserved memories of earlier ages ruled by different orders of beings. These are not isolated traditions. They are global echoes of a shared memory: that the world before the flood was governed by a stable, long-lived order that guided civilization through cosmic cycles. Our grand theory must, therefore, propose that before the flood, a custodial civilization existed, one that possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy, geology, mathematics, agriculture, and engineering, and maintained continuity across vast spans of time. The flood ended that continuity. The custodians vanished. The survivors inherited fragments. This theory explains the sudden emergence of writing, agriculture, and astronomy in Sumer. It explains why Egyptian civilization appears fully formed at its beginning. It explains why Göbekli Tepe emerges abruptly with monumental architecture and then is purposely buried. It explains why megalithic structures across the world share common features. It explains the extraordinary reign lengths in ancient king lists. It explains the mythic consistency of pre-flood, long-lived beings. But to understand how the custodial civilization functioned, we must delve deeper into their likely structure. The Sumerian King List presents the pre-flood kings as individuals, but as we've already explored, these may represent titles rather than single persons, roles passed down through long-lived lineages or entities tied to cosmic cycles. Each king might have been a station, inherited by custodians who observed a complete SAR. Over hundreds of thousands of years, these accumulated into the vast reign lengths recorded. This model aligns with the Sumerian cosmology, which emphasized order, cycle, and continuity. The cosmos was not chaotic. It was structured. Each being had a role. Each star had a path. Each epoch had a custodian. The idea of kingship descending from heaven reflects this cosmological order. Kingship wasn't political power. It was stewardship. The king was not a warrior, but a synchronizer of heaven and earth. The pre-flood custodians likely built cities not as centers of population, but as cosmological nodes, places aligned with the heavens, serving as observatories, archives, and ritual centers. Eridu, the first city, was called the navel of the earth, a place of beginnings. Its earliest structures show precise orientation. The earliest ziggurat foundations appear more advanced than later ones. This reinforces the idea that the original builders were part of a stable, long-lived civilization whose architectural knowledge eroded after the flood. The custodial civilization would have excelled in long-term observation. They would have tracked the slow wobble of Earth's axis, the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of nearly 26,000 years. They would have recorded changing coastlines, climate shifts, and celestial alignments. Their cities may have been positioned at specific latitudes and longitudes to monitor these cycles. Megalithic sites across the world, Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge, Nabta Playa, Corral, Teotihuacan, display alignments with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. Perhaps these were remnants of a global network of observation nodes, but the custodial civilization's most significant achievement may have been knowledge preservation. The Me, the Sumerian term for the fundamental structures of civilization, were described as eternal, unchanging, originating before humans. These included laws, writing, mathematics, crafts, rituals, and cosmology. The custodians preserved the Me, teaching them to post-flood humans as they rebuilt. This interpretation explains why writing appears suddenly in Sumer, fully formed, why advanced astronomy appears early, why agriculture emerges abruptly in the Fertile Crescent, why early calendars were so precise, why myths describe the 7 sages teaching humans after the flood. It also explains the global nature of ancient parallels. If the custodial civilization had a worldwide presence or influence, its memory would appear in many cultures. And it does. The similarities between flood myths, creation accounts, early kings, and cosmological systems become less mysterious if they originate from a shared pre-flood source. But what ended this civilization? To answer this, we must examine geological, astronomical, and mythological clues. The most likely scenario is a cataclysm triggered by a combination of environmental and cosmic factors. Around 12,900 years ago, the Earth entered the Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions. Evidence suggests this was triggered by an impact event or a burst of cosmic activity. Meltwater pulses from collapsing ice sheets caused rapid sea level rise. Tsunamis swept across coastlines. Climate patterns shifted abruptly. This event aligns with global flood myths. For a civilization built along coastlines, a logical choice for long-term observation, agriculture, and trade, it would have been catastrophic. Entire cities would have been submerged, knowledge centers destroyed, the custodial order broken. If the custodians were long-lived beings or lineages, their population may have been small. A global catastrophe could have wiped them out, leaving only scattered survivors. These survivors, stripped of their infrastructure, unable to maintain the continuity of knowledge, would have integrated with human groups, passing on fragments of memory that became myth. Alternatively, if the custodial civilization depended on specific environmental conditions, long stable climate, moderate sea levels, the upheavals could have made their survival impossible. Their withdrawal might have appeared to later generations as abandonment or divine punishment. The grand theory suggests that the custodial civilization did not vanish entirely in an instant. Instead, its decline may have occurred over centuries. As the Earth's climate shifted, their knowledge centers fell. Their influence waned. They may have attempted to preserve what they could, building memory sites like Göbekli Tepe, instructing survivors, encoding knowledge in stone. But eventually, the last of them disappeared, leaving humanity to rebuild. This explains why early post-flood civilizations show flashes of brilliance, followed by stagnation. The knowledge inherited from the custodians was too advanced to sustain without the long-lived system that produced it. Over time, it fragmented. But these fragments remain embedded in our myths, our architecture, our mathematics, our calendars, our languages. They whisper of a world that ran on different principles, a world guided by cycles rather than lifespans, by cosmic order rather than political ambition. The Sumerian King List is one of the most intact of these whispers. It records the reigns of the pre-flood custodians using their own system, SARS, NORS, SOS, units of cosmic time. It preserves their structure even though the world that produced it is gone. It reminds us that the world before the flood was not primitive. It was organized, it was stable, it was old. And perhaps the most important question is not how that world ended. It is whether we have already rediscovered fragments of its knowledge without realizing their true origin. Think of the mystery of Göbekli Tepe, who taught hunter-gatherers to carve stone pillars weighing tons. Think of the precise alignments of the pyramids. Why did early builders understand Earth's cardinal directions, the dimensions of the planet, and the precessional cycle? Think of the megalithic constructions of Peru. Why did early cultures build with polygonal stones that resist earthquakes? Think of ancient maps showing accurate coastlines from thousands of years before known civilizations. Each of these anomalies could be a surviving echo of the custodial civilization. And if these are echoes, then the question becomes, what else remains hidden? As we move deeper into this grand theory, we will follow the clues into the climax of the story, a reconstruction of the cataclysm that ended the 241,000-year reigns and the existential implications it holds for us today. Because if the custodial order once guided humanity through cosmic cycles, what cycle are we living in now? To reach the emotional and conceptual climax of this story, the moment where the scattered fragments of myth, Archaeology, astronomy, and ancient memory converge into a single overwhelming realization. We must step into the final days of the world before the flood, not as a symbolic ending, not as a metaphorical cleansing, but as a real historical catastrophe that shattered a civilization so old, so stable, and so deeply intertwined with cosmic cycles that its fall created a rupture in human memory. This is the moment where the 241,000-year reigns end. This is the moment the custodial order collapses. This is the point at which the world we live in begins. To imagine the cataclysm, you must first imagine the world that preceded it, for hundreds of thousands of years. If the Sumerian King List is taken at face value, a stable custodial civilization guided humanity and the natural world through cosmic cycles. Rivers changed course, but the custodians adapted. Coastlines rose and fell, but the custodians persisted. Stars shifted their positions slowly across the sky, and the custodians recorded their movements patiently. Their continuity allowed them to build, rebuild, and refine a global network of knowledge that spanned the planet. And then, almost in an instant from their perspective, everything changed. The Earth entered a period of extreme instability around 12,900 years ago. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas boundary. Archaeologists refer to it as the moment agriculture stalled, settlements collapsed, and megafauna died suddenly. Climate scientists describe it as a global shock event that plunged the world into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. Traditional historians view it as the boundary between prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies and early human civilization. But the Sumerians remembered it differently. They remembered it as the flood, a cataclysm so complete that it wiped out an entire order of beings who had ruled the world for 241,000 years. This is where the climax begins. Imagine standing on the coastline of the pre-flood world, not as we imagine ancient coastlines today, but as they truly were, lower by hundreds of feet, stretching far into what is now ocean, dotted with cities, astronomical observatories, agricultural hubs, and knowledge centers. These regions, now submerged, would have been the lifeblood of the custodial civilization. Their cities would have been aligned to long-term celestial observations, placed with meticulous care to track solstices, equinoxes, and precessional cycles. Their architecture, built by long-lived beings who understood the slow rhythms of the earth, would have been designed for permanence across ages. And then, the ice sheets began to melt, not slowly, not gradually, but violently. One theory holds that a massive comet or fragmenting swarm of cosmic bodies struck the North American ice sheet, releasing megatons of water into the oceans and sending shockwaves of fire and debris into the atmosphere. Another theory suggests that a solar micronova, a rare but powerful burst of solar energy, hit the Earth and destabilized the climate. A third idea is that Earth passed through a dense cloud of cosmic dust, reflecting sunlight and plunging the world into cold. Each of these theories is grounded in evidence: nanodiamonds found in the soil, black mats indicating sudden biomass burn, meltwater pulses recorded in ocean sediments, abrupt temperature shifts in ice cores. Whatever the mechanism, the result was the same. The sea rose, the rains came, rivers overflowed, ice sheets broke apart like shattered glass. Tsunamis swept across coastlines with unimaginable force. The sky darkened for years, forests burned, species vanished. And the civilizations of the pre-flood world built on low-lying coasts, dependent on stable climates, reliant on astronomical order, collapsed. Imagine the custodians watching this unfold. Imagine beings who had governed the world for tens of thousands of years suddenly realizing that their era was ending. Not by conflict, not by rebellion, but by nature itself. Their knowledge, so carefully preserved across ages, would have been powerless against the rising waters. Their cities, built with stone engineered to last millennia, would have been swallowed by the sea. Their libraries, their observatories, their temples, all lost beneath waves and sediment. This is where the myths of divine councils, heavenly decrees, and cosmic punishments emerge. The decision by the Anunnaki to send the flood may reflect not a literal act of divine wrath, but a metaphorical retelling of the custodians' inability to stop the catastrophe. To the survivors, humans living under their guidance, the destruction would have appeared deliberate, incomprehensible, divine. Trauma transforms memory. Trauma turns history into mythology. But what of the custodians themselves? The Sumerians wrote that only a handful survived. The Apkallu, the 7 sages, were said to dwell before the flood, and after it only one, Utanapishtim, was granted immortality. The rest perished or withdrew. This suggests that the custodial order depended on specific environmental or infrastructural conditions that the flood destroyed. Without those conditions, their longevity may have been compromised, their population decimated, their knowledge impossible to maintain. Imagine the last of the custodians standing on a hill as the waters recede, looking down at a world unrecognizable. The land is mud and silence. The cities are gone. The sky is pale and clouded. The survivors are scattered, frightened, disoriented. The custodial world is over. The cycle has ended. And so the custodians make a final choice. They gather the survivors. They teach them what little they can. They pass down fragments of the me. They tell them to rebuild. They warn them that the world will take centuries to heal. But they also know something else, something that becomes the emotional heart of the climax. They are not coming back. The world of the pre-flood custodians is gone. The flood didn't just erase their cities. It erased the conditions that allowed their civilization to exist. The custodians cannot recreate what once was. Their knowledge, once continuous across ages, is now broken. Their order has collapsed. They are no longer rulers, but refugees. This realization, the moment when beings who lived through tens of thousands of years confront their own extinction, is the silent climax that echoes through the Sumerian King List. Because the King List is not just a record of reigns. It is a eulogy, a memorial to a world that ended. But the emotional weight of this climax deepens when we consider what happened next. The survivors, humans who had lived under the guidance of beings with millennia of memory, were suddenly alone. Their rebuilt world lacked the cosmic order, the architectural precision, and the stability of the pre-flood era. They tried to reproduce it, but they could only grasp fragments. Kingship returned, but the reigns shrank from millennia to decades. Cities rose, but they lacked the cosmological alignment. Writing re-emerged, but with far fewer symbols and far simpler structure. Astronomy persisted, but it lost its grand, multi-epochal context. In psychological terms, the post-flood world suffered cultural amnesia, but not complete amnesia. The survivors remembered the custodians. They remembered their wisdom, their power, their longevity. They remembered the flood that ended their rule. They remembered the world before. And they preserved these memories in the only forms available to them: myths, king lists, rituals, and architecture. This explains the structure of the Sumerian King List. The pre-flood kings are not interpreted as human rulers. They are remembered as beings of cosmic authority, custodians of cycles. The numbers, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, reflect not lifetimes, but epochs. The flood marks the break between two worlds, the world of order and the world of recovery. After the flood, the king list becomes human. The reign lengths shrink. The cosmic becomes historical. This is the moment where the entire narrative pivots. This is the conceptual climax, the recognition that humanity is living in the aftermath of a lost age. An age erased so thoroughly that its existence is only remembered in the margins of ancient texts. And with that realization comes another. If the pre-flood world was real, if long-lived custodians truly guided early civilization, then what does that say about our place in history today? Are we the first advanced civilization, or the second, or the third, or one of many? Are we recovering knowledge or rediscovering it? Are we living at the beginning of an age or the end of one? These questions aren't speculative flair. They are built directly into the Sumerian worldview. The Sumerians believed history moved in cycles. They believed civilization rose and fell repeatedly. They believed kingship descended from heaven, was withdrawn, and would one day return. They believed the custodial order might re-emerge when the cosmic cycles aligned again. And now, for the first time in thousands of years, humanity is beginning to rediscover fragments of ancient knowledge, fragments that challenge the orthodox timeline. We are uncovering megalithic structures older than civilization. We are finding astronomical knowledge embedded in myths. We are detecting geological evidence of global cataclysms. We are discovering submerged ruins that suggest a world that existed before ours. This creates an existential tension. If the lost world was real, then we are not the peak of human history. We are the continuation of something far older, and the questions that ripple outward from this revelation become vast, almost vertiginous. What was the purpose of the custodial order? Why did they guide humanity? What knowledge did they preserve? What knowledge did we lose? What remains hidden beneath the oceans or the ice? What cycle are we living through now? This is the climax, where awe, dread, and wonder intertwine. Because the more we uncover, the more the world before the flood begins to feel less like myth and more like memory. And memory, especially ancient memory, has a way of resurfacing when the world is ready to remember. In the final part of this journey, we will descend from this climax into a calm, open-ended contemplation, reflecting not on certainty, but on the quiet mystery left behind by the custodians who ruled for 241,000 years. Because the end of their age was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of ours. As we reach the closing arc of this long, quiet journey through forgotten timelines and lost civilizations, the tempo shifts. The climax has already passed. The great flood, the fall of the custodial world, the rupture that reshaped human history. Now we are in the soft descent, the gentle settling of dust after the storm. This is where the echoes become whispers, and the questions become deeper than any definitive answer could satisfy. This is where the truth of the 241,000-year reigns stops feeling like a challenge to history and starts feeling like a mirror held up to the human experience itself. Because the end of that ancient age was not a finale, It was a beginning. It was the quiet birth of our world, the fragile, incomplete world we inhabit today. Imagine standing on the flood-scarred land 1,000 years after the cataclysm. The earth has begun to heal. Grasses grow where mud once choked the plains. Rivers carve new paths. The sky clears. New generations rise with no direct memory of the custodial beings who ruled before. And yet, the stories persist. Not as precise records, they faded too quickly for that, but as fragments, as shadows, as myths. They survived not in tablets or inscriptions, but in the collective dreams of humanity, whispered around fires, sung in epics, carved into stone, and finally written into clay. By the time the Sumerian scribes pressed their reeds into wet tablets, the original world was long gone. What they preserved was memory refracted through time, distorted, softened, but still carrying the unmistakable weight of something real. This is why the Sumerian King List feels so strangely calm when you read it. It does not sensationalize. It does not embellish. It simply states that kingship descended from heaven, that rulers governed for tens of thousands of years, and that after the flood, their reigns shrank. There is no attempt to dramatize the unthinkable. There is only the quiet matter-of-factness of memory. As if the scribes themselves knew the full truth had already slipped beyond reach, and all they could do was honor its outline. As we close this documentary, we must shift our focus from the lost world itself to the lingering traces it left in ours. Not physical ruins, they're mostly gone, but something subtler, a philosophical imprint. A sense, shared across cultures, that history is older, deeper, and more layered than the surface suggests. This imprint manifests in myths of golden ages, of divine kings, of cosmic cycles, of floods, of rebirth. It is a pattern so universal it transcends geography. The Greeks, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Maya, the Hindus, the Chinese, all carried fragments of an earlier world. None remembered it perfectly, but none forgot it entirely. Why? Because humanity inherited more than tools and agriculture from the survivors of the flood. We inherited a haunting, a sense of loss so profound that even now, thousands of years later, we still feel it in our bones. We don't just wonder who came before us. We feel that someone came before us, that something was lost, that civilization did not begin with us, but resumed with us. This intuition is built into our stories, our symbols, our architecture, and even our silence. If you pause now, wherever you're listening from, and consider the world around you, you may begin to sense that haunting. Think of how strangely advanced our earliest civilizations were. Think of how precise their astronomy was. Think of the megalithic structures that still defy explanation. Think of how quickly humans went from scattered hunter-gatherers to building cities aligned with the stars. Think of the deep memory embedded in our myths. Think of the cycles of rise and fall that seem to repeat across ages. And then imagine this. What if our world feels incomplete, not because we lack knowledge, but because we are living in the shadow of a world that was complete? What if part of us remembers that completeness? This is not a conclusion. It is an opening. Because the deeper you look into the 241,000-year reigns, the more the question shifts from, did it happen, to, what does it mean? The truth hidden behind the King List isn't simply that ancient beings may have ruled for incomprehensible spans of time. The deeper truth is that humanity has always lived at the edge of something bigger than itself. something cyclical, something cosmic, something that rises and falls in ways we barely understand. And this brings us to the philosophical heart of the story, the idea that history is not linear, not a straight line from primitive beginnings to modern complexity. Instead, it is a series of waves, crests and troughs, ages of light and ages of forgetting. Civilizations rise, reach a point of brilliance, collapse, and are reborn from their own ashes. Sometimes the waves are small, sometimes they reset the entire world. The flood was one such reset. And if history truly moves in cycles, cosmic, environmental, cultural, then the flood was not unique. It was one turning of a vast wheel, one Sar in a chain of Sar upon Sar, and the custodial beings of the pre-flood era may not have been the first order to guide humanity, nor the last. Imagine for a moment that the custodians of the ancient world were themselves inheritors, that they too preserved fragments of an even older age. And that age preserved fragments of something older still. This cascading chain of memory, broken by cycles of catastrophe, might stretch back much further than even the Sumerians dared to record. If this is true, then we are not living in the first human civilization, nor even the second. We are living in a long sequence, a series of forgotten worlds, each built on the ruins of the one before. And this realization does not diminish us. It deepens us. It connects us to a lineage of mystery that spans epochs beyond imagination. It invites us to see ourselves not as the peak of history, but as custodians of a new cycle, a new chapter, a new Sar. What does this mean for our future? It means that the past is not finished. It means that echoes of the pre-flood world still resonate. It means that the answers we seek about pyramids, megaliths, myths, alignments, lost technologies are not random anomalies. They are remnants, and remnants always point back to their source. Maybe the Sumerians were not trying to shock us with their impossible reign lengths. Maybe they were trying to remind us. The world is older than you think. Humanity is older than you think. Civilization is older than you think. And the loss that sits at the core of our memory is older than any written word. As the narrative draws to a close, imagine yourself standing once more on the plains of ancient Mesopotamia. The sun is low. The dust glows. The ruins of Eridu stretch before you, silent, broken, yet somehow still alive with the faint pulse of memory. You close your eyes, and for a moment you can almost hear the hum of the ancient world. Not loud, not clear, just a distant vibration carried across time. Maybe it is the echo of long-lived beings who once walked here. Maybe it is the rhythm of cosmic cycles repeating. Maybe it is the feeling of something waiting beneath the surface of history. And as you stand in that quiet place between what we know and what we sense, a few questions rise naturally, a gentle invitation rather than a demand. What if the story of humanity is not one story, but many? What if our ancestors preserved only the outer shell of a world whose core remains hidden? What if the next great cycle is already turning, just as invisible to us now as the flood was to the custodians? The truth is that we will never fully reconstruct the world before the flood. We will never recover every detail of the 241,000-year reigns. But maybe we were never meant to. Maybe the fragments are enough. Maybe the purpose of the mystery is not to answer it, but to feel it, to sense the depth of time behind us, the fragility of the world we inhabit, and the possibility that the next chapter might be just as unexpected as the last. So let this story settle gently into your mind, not as fact, not as fiction, but as memory, shared, collective, imperfect, ancient. The kind of memory that civilizations do not fully understand until long after they have risen and fallen. The custodial world is gone, but its echo remains. And as long as we keep listening, quietly, patiently, that echo will continue to guide us, like a faint star just visible at the edge of the night. Because some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be remembered